Right, so welcome to week 5. Today we're going to talk about 3D scanning and then what do we do with those 3D scans once we have them in order to get them into the slicer, sliced, and ready to print. So we're going to do a little bit of work with those phone apps that I sent you the email, so either Polycam or Reality Scan. They do very similar things. We'll talk about basically two different ways of using those apps to get scans in. And then we'll take the results of those scans into Blender. I'll show you some tricks about how to make a bottom for them flat so they'll actually print instead of being kind of wonky on the bottom. Cleaning stuff up. We might take a look at some of the sculpting tools that Blender has to sculpt on top of 3D objects. I was going to try to get to that the last time we did Blender, but we ran out of time, so this might be a good chance to apply some of those tools. And then hopefully you'll have some time to work at the end of class. Just so you are all aware, both of these apps have a non-zero amount of processing time. So when you scan something, it'll take about 5 minutes to upload those photos to its cloud to do it. Everything processes offline. Normal computers and phones are not powerful enough to do what needs to be done to make these scans. So all of these apps, they take all of the photos that you have taken to construct the scan, and they actually do all of that processing on their servers in the cloud, which is why Polycam's not free. You're paying for your time on their servers is basically what they're charging you for. And then Reality Scan is free because it's being subsidized by the fact that this game company wants to use your objects in their games if they want to, I guess, is how they're paying for it themselves. So what we'll do is I'll show you some demos of a scan. If you want to scan your objects alongside me, that way it'll take about 10 or 15 minutes to process these things. I've got a scan that I did earlier that I'll bring into Blender. So while I'm showing you some of the tips and tricks in Blender, it'll be processing along with everybody. And then by the time you have time to work on them, hopefully they'll all be done at that point. Okay, so I've got my phone out here. I'm going to use Polycam to begin with, but I'll do another demo with Reality Scan, although the process is almost identical between the two apps. And we'll do the two different techniques of how to scan something. So I'm using Apple, but both of these applications work on Android. I don't know if anybody has Android, but you can if you need to. So the first one that I'm going to open is Polycam. And what it presents you with is basically what looks exactly like a photo app. So it is going to look just like you're taking pictures. One of the things that I like to change when using this app is first off, make sure you're in photo mode. If you have a Pro iPhone, it might default to LiDAR mode, which is good for low resolution scans of like large places. So if you want to scan like a whole room, LiDAR is a good way to do that, but it doesn't have the resolution that the photo mode does for getting little intricate pieces of objects. So I like to use the photo mode. And then the other thing that I like to change before I get started is that this toggle here that looks like a video camera versus a photography camera, I have that toggled over to manual. Polycam tries to take enough pictures to get a good scan on its own, but I like to have more control over that process, so I just flip it to manual. So it's just expecting me to push the plus button every you make a small move, hit the button, take another picture, make a small move, hit the button. The whole idea is that you're trying to capture the object that you're scanning from every possible angle that has detail that you care about. So for example, I have my object here that I want to scan. I don't really care about the bottom because it's flat, and also like that's how I'm going to print it, so it's not really going to print a lot of detail on the bottom anyway. In terms of objects that are easy or hard to scan, you want to pick objects that are not shiny. Shiny things will really throw off how it's trying to look at objects because now they're reflecting other things in themselves. Or things like glass is really hard to scan because now it's looking through the glass. That's not to say you can't scan them. One of the ways that people scan either reflective or shiny objects is that you can take like chalk spray or masking tape and cover your object with that. So now it is opaque and matte. And then you can scan it that way. So that's a way to get at scanning objects that otherwise, like a wine glass or something, would be hard to scan. You just spray it with chalk spray. Now it's opaque white and you can scan it. The other thing to watch out for is that you have to be careful about what's in the background of what you're scanning. It doesn't know necessarily that I want to scan this object until I've made my way all the way around it. And it might start picking up things in the background. If I scan on a turntable, it might start picking up the turntable. Some of that is going to be inevitable. Again, like it's almost always going to have at least some of the base that you put it on. And we'll get rid of that in Blender. But sometimes Reality Scan tends to do this a little bit more, where if it sees a lot of your environment, it will make the scan much bigger than what you're expecting it to be. So just watch out for having a kind of sparse background. I have taken to using like big flat white panels sometimes just to stop this behavior. So we have craft paper over here. You can construct a little tent if you want to, if you find that your first scan wasn't turning out super well. I have found this to be less of a problem in Polycam, but don't be sad if the first scan that you do ends up really wonky. A lot of it might just be that the environment got a little bit too busy. So I'm going to start just the demo here of how it looks when I scan something. So I'm going to do this first one using this turntable. And the whole idea here is that you're trying to give Polycam as much information as you can for it to work with. So really you're aiming for somewhere around 50 photos for an object of this size. 10 is not enough. 300 is probably too many. Not that it would certainly use that, but you're probably wasting your time more than anything at that point. So what I'm going to do is I'm kind of just horizontal with the object right now. So I'm mostly on this pass focusing on the details that are on the side. So I'm going to take the picture, hitting that plus button, and then I'm going to turn it by maybe 10 or 15 degrees. Make sure that it's not wobbling, that the object is steady, and then take the next picture. And then I will keep doing that all the way around my object. You'll get faster at this, like once as you see kind of what it's looking for in terms of how to scan objects.
And so you don't need to have your iPhone on a tripod, or is it?
No, because there's a lot of machine learning and those kinds of algorithms in this process that's trying to pick out the points that it can see are similar to the points in the other photos. And one of the rules of thumb that both applications say is you want somewhere between 60 and 80% overlap of the last photo so that it has enough points of reference to look for. Right? If I turned this all the way around, it might not know that it's even looking at the same object. So that's why I'm kind of making small moves on this object just so it has enough things that it can see in the previous photos. Right, so I've made my way all the way around, kind of a horizontal pass. So now I'm going to move up. Right, so now I'm going to do another pass where I'm taking more pictures from the top of the object just to give it another view. Now down. So now it can capture more detail about like what these shapes are and maybe what's on top of this cap that it couldn't see before.
Yeah, well, I was like,
Okay, so I've made my way around the top. Now an angle that a lot of people will forget their first couple times scanning is that I have angles this way and I have angles this way. For things like the detail of like underneath these lips or like this band right here, you do really want an angle kind of going up at an object. So now I'm actually going to get a little bit lower here and take some pictures of this object from underneath. And it's the same process, but we're just trying to give it as much information as we can about this object.
And the fact that your light source is fixed while the table surface is moving, that doesn't affect the way it's reading?
If if we could be in a full photography studio setup where this would have, 8 different lights around this object being evenly lit, would we get a better scan? Yes. Would it make enough difference to the resolution that we can print in? Probably not. But you can experiment with that. Experiment with different lighting situations, and maybe something that comes out mediocre in a scan with poor lighting will work very well in good lighting. Again, what you're really trying to aim for is that you have enough similarities between pictures that it can interpret, how they connect. That's the whole trick of 3D scanning. The other word for this, if you want to look up some background information, like when you go home, is photogrammetry. This is the other word for this, is 3D photogrammetry, is the process of putting together these pictures. So I have 55 pictures taken of this object. That's probably enough. So at least in Polycam, I'll hit done. It's going to ask me some details, or some, like, what do I want to do with the processing of this. Optimized is generally too low resolution for what we would want. Again, that's for like if you're taking a big scan of a room or something, like if I wanted the layout of the pottery, I could scan this whole room, and Polycam can act on that too. I don't need all of the details of every bottle or pot that's on the shelves. So that might be where you want to go to optimized. We're probably always going to be working somewhere in between medium and full. That gives enough small detail resolution on something like this that will have enough points in Blender to play with. Raw is probably too much. Again, you can use it, but now it's overkill for how detailed we could print something on the printer. Maybe unless it's a very tiny object. I haven't tried that. That might be something worth experimenting with. The other thing that we'll almost always have checked for what we're doing for the printers is the use object masking. And what this says is it's going to apply some additional algorithms to try to take out things that aren't what it thinks is the object that you're scanning. 85% of the time, it works every time. Sometimes it will pick up a different object that's, again, in a busier background and think that that's the object you care about and remove everything else, which that's not ideal, but most of the time it works. So now I'm going to say upload and process. Like I said, this takes about 10 to 15 minutes. But that is kind of the process for now of the scan. I'm going to take it on my computer from here, and we'll go into, okay, what happens when it has told me that it is processed. All right, so what you'll see in Polycam when you have completed processing a scan, you'll see some of the other scans in here, like my dog, as well as Uni's sculpture we scanned for some work that she was doing. But the example that I want to use is actually just scanned a bag of coffee. So here's a scan that I did earlier of a bag of coffee that was on my countertop. You'll see that although this worked okay, you'll notice that I missed that upward angle, and like where the bag is bent over didn't scan completely perfectly. It's fine for our example, but this is a good lesson of like why you really want to get those underneath angles, because it didn't really get to capture that this was a fold. One of the things you can do even just in the browser is that over here, this is the full color mesh where it's using like the whole image to make your 3D, but you can actually see what the mesh will look like in Blender. So this is kind of a good preview of, do I have enough points to make this useful? Do I have anything weird that I know I'm going to have to clean up? Like, for example, I don't know what happened here, but there's this like weird little spike. I know I'm going to have to clean this up in Blender. And of course, I can look at the bottom here too, and it's fine. It looks mostly manifold, although we'll use the tools to check it. But I would want this to be flat, and I'll clean that up in Blender as well. Right, so now I can go over here and hit download, and it gives us a lot of options depending on the software that we want to use. You'll notice that we have an FBX file, which can go into Fusion. I don't think these are particularly easy to edit in Fusion. It's not really cut out for this kind of work, in my opinion, but you can if you want to try it. But we have our good old STL file here, which is the one that I almost always select in this case. Be careful about some of these other options. There are other ways of representing 3D objects that are not the normal mesh of points and edges and faces that we're used to working with. That's these ones over here. Point cloud is an interesting way of representing 3D objects in space, just using the average kind of color of a three-dimensional pixel spread out over space. This is kind of a newer technique that's especially being more and more popular in video games and like 3D animation, but it doesn't really help us here because we can't print a bunch of points in space. We really do need a mesh. So be careful with these options. They're not really what we would want for this. So I'm going to go ahead and download this. This is a 2.4 megabyte mesh. That's not too bad. Remember when we talked about getting things off of printables, really like once you start getting in the 20 or 30 megabytes, that's when you really have to be careful that you're getting too much detail. 2.4, no problem. That'll go just great. So now I can go, now that I have it downloaded, I can go back into Blender like what we're used to seeing. And we'll go, just like we did from printables, we'll go into import and we'll import an STL. And I'll just go find where that downloaded on my computer. And it is quite small apparently, but that's okay. So here is the mesh that we got scanned, right? And so if I go into edit mode, you'll see this mesh looks just like the mesh preview that we got from the online browser. But now we can start trying to clean this up a little bit. The first thing that I can do is select everything that's on the bottom and create a flat layer on the bottom. Actually, the first thing that I'm going to do is rotate this so it makes more sense in our 3D space. So I can go back into object mode, so I'm dealing with the whole object. None of you brought your Blender cheat sheets, but that's okay. We'll hit R to rotate, and we want to rotate around the x-axis. So now we can put this up in space. It's not quite right, so we'll mess with it just a little bit more. Again, like I said in Blender, most of what you're going to be doing is by eye. This is a pretty organic model that we're working with anyway, so it should be fine. So now that we're kind of facing the way that I would want it to be, we're going to go back into edit mode so I can start working with these points. We have these three buttons here. Remember, point, edge, face. I want to work with points, and I'm going to click a point that's in the center of where the bottom of my object should be. And there's an interesting tool in here that has a shortcut button if you're working on a full desktop computer keyboard, which none of us are. So the way to get to it is in the menu. If you go to select, you can say select more or less, and then select more. Which again, there is a hotkey if you use Control numpad, but none of us have numpads. So I just do this a couple times. So now you'll see it has taken every point that has connected to this point and selected all of those as well. So we can use this to select more a couple times until we've covered what feels like enough of the bottom. So that, we're starting to creep up into where we're now on the sides of my object. So this is enough for me in terms of how this scan went to be comfortable that I've selected all of the bottom part of this. And now I want to make it flat. And so one of the other tools that we learned last time we talked about Blender was the scale tool, which is the S shortcut. And by default, this is going to make things bigger and smaller on the plane that they're in. But we don't want that. Remember when I said you're in one of these edit tools, you can hit an axis to constrain it to that axis. And what we want, the axis that we want to constrain the bottom to is the z-axis, right? So now you can see if I scale this, it's going to move it up and down in just the z-axis. And what I can actually tell it to do now is say, I want you to scale everything so that it is 0. It's flat. So now I have scaled all of this to the same axis. I can click to apply it. And now I have what is mostly a flat bottom. You'll see that I have actually some issues here. That's not a big deal. Can anyone think of why that's not a big deal? Using the tools that we know of in Blender. If I use the move tool, G for grab, constrain that in the Z direction, I can just move this down a little bit more so that now I know that this bottom is the lowest point on my object.
Could you go and view at a perfect
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, so that would be the way to do it, right? Is I could click one of these axes, look from the side. So let's undo it so you can see what I've done, right? You can see if I look from the side that my selection is not actually is not low enough, right? So this is a good angle to do it from. Again, G for grab, Z to constrain it in that axis, and then I can move it down so I know that it's the bottommost part. Now that's created some faces that are a little weird, but that's okay because we're going to play with this model a little bit more. But it's not that much different than what we've done, you know, working with the cat and the monkey head from last time. It's just now, instead of finding this object on the internet, we've just created it ourselves.
How did you get the bottom? Was it on its side?
No, I scanned it on a turntable. So that if we go and look at the like full color version of this scan, you'll see that it's just blank on the bottom, like it's just black. It's trying its best to like interpret around what it saw from the edges, but there's no information about the bottom. So no, I did not scan the bottom. Something like, maybe not this, but for example, Yumi's balloon dog, you could scan the bottom. It's rigid, so it's not going to change its shape. You could actually flip it upside down and take another circular pass around the bottom. Again, making sure that you have enough overlap from the sides, and most of the time, Polycam and Reality Scan is good enough to pick that up and run with that. This bag of coffee, probably not as much, because it's going to change its shape, even just subtly, when I go to flip it upside down, and that's going to mess it all up, because now the shape is not the same, so it doesn't know how to line it up. And so for this print, and a lot of the prints you're going to do, since you're going to do this flattening procedure on the bottom anyway, I tend to not scan the bottom, but yeah, that's up to you, what parts of the model are important to you. Maybe you don't care about the top. Scan it upside down then. And then, because maybe you're going to put something on the top of it in Blender, you're going to add another object to it or something. You know, like it's, again, part of the process is thinking through like, how are you going to use this object? What's the best way for me to manipulate this to get it there? I'm going to check on our other scan real quick, just to make sure it is still, no, we're still uploading, so we still got some time to go. So right now I have this bag, right, and we've made it so it's printable because we have that nice flat bottom. And if you remember, one of the things that is usually a good tool that you can use for 3D scans is the decimate tool. So if I go into generate, this is in the modifiers, that wrench icon, if you remember from before, you can go into the modifiers and add these algorithms to do things to your model. Decimate's a good one because it'll take out, again, remember that weird like hook thing that we saw? Like that doesn't need to be part of the model. So if I reduce the complexity of this, that'll go a long way, a little bit too long of a way, but that'll go a long way to kind of smoothing out a lot of the weird scan imperfections. So you can see we're at 40% of what this model used to be, and we're still preserving a lot of the detail without having to worry about a lot of the kind of weirdness in this model. I might turn it up just a little bit more. So okay, that is usually the first pass that I'll do is that decimate. And if you want to apply it, again, you click this drop down and then hit apply. And now that's actually in our editable mesh. Another thing that you could do, just like we did last time, is you could use the remesh option. Clearly that's not a small enough voxel size. So this is another way to kind of iron out these details. So we can Remember to be careful as you click through these to not create too much geometry to crash your computer. But that's a nice option, right, to be able to smooth out some of the weirdnesses that scans will sometimes give you. So again, if we go into here and hit apply, we can now see our mesh looks something like this. A little bit more complicated than with the decimate, but it has also given us some geometry back around the bottom part that we messed with. And that opens the door to using some new tools that I didn't talk about last time. So if we go back into edit mode, if we go back into object mode, you'll see, we still have some weirdness that I don't like about this, right? We still have this little hook here that I don't really like. We have this lip around where we kind of stretched out that bottom. And I want to take care of those things, but I don't want to I don't want to go into edit mode and select this and then use the grab tool. Like that's really tedious, right? I don't want to do that. There's a better way to be able to move this geometry around that feels a little bit more sculptural and a little bit more of what we do with pottery. And that's actually in the sculpt mode of Blender. So if you look under the object mode dropdown, which is where we were going between object mode and edit mode last time, there's some additional options here. Some of them are not important to us for 3D printing, like the texture paint section of this. We'll never deal with textures because we're not applying images onto these models because we're not doing 3D animation. But one of the interesting things that we can use is this sculpt mode. And this brings us into a whole other toolbox down the left side here of a bunch of tools that are very similar to tools that we use in actual clay sculpting that we can now apply to our 3D model in software. So, this is things like the draw tool. We can draw sharps, so this is like making creases. We can inflate things. We can take a fake thumb and smear things. We can smooth things. There's a bunch of tools in here, like we can grab something and move it. So this takes the proportional editing thing that we were doing last time to a whole other level of how do we move around this mesh in a way that feels a little bit more organic. So for example, I can go into this smooth tool and you'll notice it gives me this red circle. And I've got a bunch of different tools up now here at the top. So I can have a big radius or a small radius. I can change the strength of how much smoothing it's going to apply. But now I can go over my mesh and apply these tools just like it were actual clay. So I can go around this model and apply this smooth tool to these kind of bumps that I don't like as part of the bottom of this. So I'm just going to go around here and smooth out this bottom. If I want it to go faster, I can turn up the strength. Right, so now I can go over here and smooth this out, and smooth this out, and smooth this out. So I've really taken care of, and here's that weird hook thing, we'll smooth this out. Just like it was clay, I'm just, I'm taking a sponge and running it over my model. And Blender is doing what it thinks is the best approximation of that. If I go back into edit mode, you'll see this is changing the mesh. This is not just a modifier, like you are changing the points in the mesh. Something that is interesting about sculpt mode is that it will not add or subtract points unless you tell it that that is what you want to do. And this can create some strangeness because sometimes if you're doing things that are significantly altering the mesh, it will run out of points to work with. One of the big ones that tends to do this is this snake hook tool. And you can think of this as like grabbing a chunk of your clay and like stretching it out, right? So if I take this snake hook tool here, you'll see eventually it runs out of points and the model starts to break. If we go into edit mode, you'll see like there's just not enough points for it to represent this weird stretchy part in a cohesive way anymore. So let's go back into sculpt mode and we'll undo that so that I can show you some of the other tools. There are two ways that you can get at telling Blender that, hey, like I want to use this snake hook tool and I want you to create more points on my model to account for it. The first one is that this gives you an option to remesh right here in the sculpt environment. So this is the same as what you would be doing in the remesh modifier. It's just here because when you're sculpting, this is something that you'll probably do at least a couple times. When you're in this sculpting realm, it is the same as the way I explained it before. You kind of want to make big changes until you need more detail. And then you use this remesh tool and put in more geometry. And then you can go in, zoom in on your model, add more details. Maybe you make the whole eye structure. Then you remesh so you have enough geometry that you can go in and make eyelids. And then, depending on the detail of your model, you remesh again so you can go in and make eyelashes. I don't know that you'll ever print that, but that's just an example of this kind of multiple steps of remeshing. One of the newer features of this sculpt mode that Blender has added in the last couple of years is this other option called Dyne Topo, which it stands for Dynamic Topology. And what this is telling Blender is, hey, add geometry to the regions that I am making new as you think it is necessary. And this is a tool of the with great power comes great responsibility type, because Dyne Topo typically works at the level that you are zoomed into the model. If I am zoomed in very far and trying to work on small details, it's going to start adding lots and lots of mesh to that little region. If I am zoomed out and have Dyne Topo toggled on and use a tool, even on something that has a lot of detail in it, it might trash all of that detail as it tries to remesh. So be careful with Dyne Topo. It is really convenient, but it is also a way of ruining something that you just spend an hour modeling. So let's turn Dyne Topo on, and now we'll use the snake hook tool, and you'll see Dyne Topo is now creating new geometry, although it's still not perfect. And we might have to change some of these options here, right? We have this detail size here that we can play with, that it will actually tell it to make more geometry, right? And if I zoom in, you'll see that it will create finer geometry and finer geometry and finer geometry, which that's great until I'm now zoomed out again and want to use it again and look at how it just destroyed all of it. That's why you have to be careful with Dyne Topo. This is something that I will toggle on and off and on and off and on and off and on and off as I am wanting geometry and then just want to modify it and not add more, right? Because that's the actual solution, right? I'm zoomed in. I create some really nice geometry. This is not nice, but just as an example, this is at least complex geometry, right? I like that, how that is in the model. I will now turn this off before I start using other tools, right? So maybe now I want to use the grab tool here and grab this and move it out. That way I'm not destroying this nice geometry that I've just created. And then maybe I'll go in and turn Dyne Topo back on and work on some other details. But yeah, just be careful, because now if we go into edit mode, look at what it has done, right, to our mesh, is that it's gotten way more complicated in just this region, which is fine, just something to be cognizant of, that this is a way to go from a 3 megabyte model to a 50 megabyte model without thinking about it, because you're in this resolution working on some crazy fine details to put in the fine lines of someone's face, and then you zoom out and realize that everything else is this level of resolution, and now now your model runs super slow, or whatever the case may be. Does that make sense in terms of sculpting tools? There's a lot of cool sculpting tools to play with in Blender. I really like this. This is one of my favorite parts of Blender, because you get to take these models that you've scanned or find on the internet and really play with them like they're clay. Yeah. So you can see there's like grab, draw sharp, clay strips. Like that's just like you adding more clay on top of something. Here's the sharp crease tool. So you can really play with this 3D model like it was clay sitting on your desk. People spend whole careers in this tool doing cool things for 3D animation. But it's useful for us too, right? So there's just lots of these cool tools in here to play around with, right? This pinch tool. And again, you can always change the radius and strength of these to get more interesting effects. I've created something that's definitely not printable now because of this giant hook part. And just because we've started to sculpt in something doesn't mean that we can't go back to our normal editing tools. Remember when we cut the head off of the cat, if I don't like this part of it, I could get rid of it with the sculpt tools, probably. It is probably easier to do what we did before, right? We'll turn on X-ray mode so that we can select all the way through the object, select the part of it that I don't like anymore, X to delete vertices, and so now we've deleted that weird snaky bit. I'm going to turn off X-ray mode because it's hard to look at. And so now we have a hole, which if we go into our 3D printing things and say check, it's probably going to tell us that this is not manifold, I hope, although this might take a second because this is more vertices than we're normally used to working with. Yep, so we'll see we have a non-manifold edges, and it's hopefully only going to tell us about the hole because I think everything else should be manifold. This is really nice because by clicking that, it's highlighted these for me. And I can use a really easy thing in here on edges. Where is it? There's a fill tool. So it's actually in face. With these edges selected, I can hit fill, and it will just make the closest connections it can to close the mesh. Right, so now if I hit check again, it should say that it's 0. I hope. Yeah. So now we're back to a manifold model that doesn't have that weird snaky bit and may or may not be printable, right? You can think of the options that this opens up, right? Because now I have what used to be a coffee bag, and maybe I can use these sculptural tools in Blender to make a face on the side of it and talk about the face of coffee in my artwork or whatever you want your artist statement to be at that point. And then just like anything else, right, I can now take this model, I can export it as an STL. We'll just put it in this documents folder for now. We'll say sculpted coffee, export. And then if we wanted to, we could go into our slicer. We can import STL. This was in my documents. Sculpted coffee. This again, remember in Blender, this model was really small there. The slicer is saying like, this is too small. Do we want to just recalculate it? We can hit yes, and then the slicer will try to get it as close as it can. But remember, in the slicer, I can always scale it up too, right? So I can go over here to the scale and say, let's make that 4 times bigger. And now here is my bag of coffee with some sculptural details on it. In the slicer, this is set to the smaller printer. That's fine just for this example. We hit slice, and now we have what this will look like coming out of the printer. Is this printable hollow? Maybe. I'm looking for those overhang perimeters. I don't see any. That's promising. There's one little one right here, but it's just cutting that corner. Probably not a problem. Keep going up. There's a couple right here. Again, I would probably try it. And we're moving up. It looks like this will maybe print hollow, so we might not even need infill. This is a half-an-hour print to print our sculptural coffee bag. I'm not going to print it, but we're basically at the point where we can now feed this into the printer. From a coffee bag that was sitting on my table this morning to printed in clay. That is all that I wanted to talk about today in terms of 3D scanning. I want to give you all a chance to do this yourself with some support. Or if you have other questions, I'm happy to help with that. But that is the extent of what I want to go through today.